Jill Lane. I am a coordinator for the political science program at North Seattle College. We have put together a robust group for you, but first I'd like us to give our land acknowledgement. DeAndre Fisher, Executive Vice President of the North Seattle College Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, will now share with us and share the rules of engagement for our discussion. Thanks, DeAndre.
Thank you so much, Jill. As we have as best practice and policies, and we would like to start off with our land acknowledgement, and it reads as follows. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continue to honor and bring light into their ancient heritage. Without them, we wouldn't have access to this gathering, dialogue, learning, or Zoom space. We ask that you take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land, air, and water who are still here. And we also want you to make sure to do your own personal actions to ensure that you are truly doing what you need to do to represent our First and Native people. I will now go into what we know is our guidelines for this space. Thank you for creating this space. We will be sure to follow all district procedures and policies applying to this space. This is a brave, kind, and safe space, so harassment, discrimination, and hate speech or sexual behavior will not be tolerated. Anyone violating these policies and procedures will be immediately removed and faced with district consequences. We value everyone's chance to share, which means that we encourage people to take up time, but those who are taking up more time, we encourage you to give the floor to others. And we ask that each of the guest speakers who will be presenting to take floor. In case we do have a Zoom bomb, we will then close down the meeting, remove them, and send out a new link. And that is the guidelines for today. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. I would like to let you know how we're going to organize today. I am going to introduce the panelists and they will tell you a little bit about themselves. After that, Shireen Deboo, who has now been made co-host, she'll be pulling up her PowerPoint. Shireen is a librarian at North Seattle College who specializes in sources, quality, and such. And she's going to talk to us about how we can know whether the sources we're looking at when all of this stuff is happening so quickly, what's legitimate and what's not. Shireen has created a search engine for our political science classes that students love, and that's incredibly helpful. So Shireen, as I am introducing the panelists for after your discussion, you can go ahead and bring up your PowerPoint. You have been designated to be able to do that. First, I am Jill Lane. I have been at North Seattle College for 15 years this January. I have worked in Congress and have worked here for longer than I was in Congress. Deepa, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Deepa Bandaru. I am the Social Justice and Intersectional Studies faculty here at North Seattle. I got my PhD in political science at UW. So I have a background in politics, but primarily political theory, race, ethnicity, and gender.
Thank you, Deepa. I appreciate it. Cristobal Borges, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Jill. Cristobal Borges, my preferred pronouns are he, him, él. And I teach history at North Seattle College. I got my doctorate from the University of Texas at El Paso in borderlands history with a focus in United States and Latin American history. And my bread and butter is US history teaching. So yeah, it's been some interesting times.
Thank you, Chris. Jonathan Harrington, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Jonathan Harrington. I got my PhD at Loyola University in Chicago. And I've been teaching political science here for a couple of years. And I'd especially like to thank Shireen for all the help she's given all my students, I'm sure everybody else, extra time and effort she's put in to help all of our programs move forward.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome. Zachary Gass, you're next.
Hey folks, Zach Gass, political science, North Seattle. thanks for being here. This is going to be an interesting conversation, I think. So I'm going to just wrap it up there and pass the torch.
Zach teaches political science for us as well.
Yes, thank you.
And
Sorry.
last but certainly not least, Larry Kushney.
Hi there. Larry Kushney, faculty of political science, South Seattle College. I've been teaching at colleges around this area for the last 14 years or so, and excited to jump into the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This is our panel, and they are all amazing and wonderful colleagues. Right now, though, we're going to start with Shireen Dabu. If you'll, we'll welcome her. Shireen, you can start whenever you're ready.
I think you're muted, Shireen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So I have a few slides. They're just partly to provide a little bit of visual for those who are visual learners. And really what I want to do is just offer some strategies for your media consumption and some ways to frame the content that we're getting access to right now. I'm also trying to figure out my, okay, let's see how this works. So the first question that I think it's worth asking, sorry guys, not sure why I'm having so much trouble with this. I think this is an important question. What are you looking at? Are you looking at an actual report, a journalistic report of a specific event, or are you looking at commentary, opinion, and analysis? I've observed that over the last several years, these two categories have kind of merged in a lot of ways. And I think it's really important as a reader to try and identify what kind of information you're looking at. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of the distinctions are between what we might call straight news reporting and what might be better categorized as a news analysis or commentary. So I think one way to think about it is what are journalistic qualities? And these are some of the criteria that you might look for in terms of identifying, are you looking at something that is actually a news report? Traditionally, the things we look for in a news source are quotes from ideally multiple sources. Another thing that is tricky these days in news reporting is that sources don't always want to let you know who they are. And the gold standard for your quotes is that they tell you who they are. They actually give you their name and they let you know where they're from. A lot of times, folks want to stay anonymous, and there's justifiable reasons why they might want to. You might hear a reporter say sources inside the Pentagon or a source close to the president. That's sometimes the most information you can get. But when you hear that over and over again, you might ask yourself, are there other ways of verifying that information? Are multiple people and multiple reporters reporting on the same information from those inside sources? Some really basic things, are you seeing actual dates, times, locations? Where did something occur? What time did it occur? What specifically took place in that action? A little bit more about evidence. Are you seeing an image? These days, the tricky part on that is knowing whether it's been doctored or not. That's a whole nother level of awareness we need to have. But are you getting eyewitness testimony? Do you have confirmation on quotes? A lot of news sources, you might remember this from the election, this idea of some sources reporting results from particular areas, but a lot of news outlets will say we want to confirm these numbers. Confirmation is kind of the equivalent of saying I want to get multiple sources that are telling me the same thing. Other examples of evidence, actual evidence, A lot of us might have heard about primary sources. Examples of primary sources might be an actual law, a actual piece of testimony, whether that's a written report, an image. Sometimes evidence comes in the form of a financial transaction or a tax return or a transcript that indicates the actual dialogue between, say, Donald Trump and the Secretary of State in Georgia, right? It's actually having the language and the documentation of that. A traditional news source will often offer an alternative viewpoint or indicate how critics of the particular event feel about that issue, or they'll try and gather multiple perspectives on the issue. And ideally, a good news source will also provide a little bit of context for that event. I want to talk a little bit more about sources. When we talk about sources, some things to ask yourself are, who are the sources that your journalists are asking for? Are they looking at eyewitness accounts? Are they asking for information from some kind of a subject expert? That subject expert might be an academic. It might be someone who works inside a particular branch of government and has policy expertise. It could be an elected official. I think thinking about lobbyists is important because they are often a source of expert information. But I think, again, it's worth considering what is the agenda or the perspective of the lobbyist. The lobbyist could have an activist bent. The lobbyist could have a corporate bent. Understanding what their agenda is useful in terms of putting context around whatever quotes they're offering. And I've just listed here other examples of who sources could be, and also for yourself, how you might think about the characters or the people that are being quoted. What category do they fit in? How are they a stakeholder in the story? Okay, so a little bit more about the opinion side of the content universe, which is these days a lot. Even sources like the New York Times and other major journalistic outlets often have a front page, which is these days your web page, where they're listing opinion and editorial right next to the news. It's not necessarily in the back pages anymore. So as a reader, you need to be really aware of whether it is that you're looking at a news report or whether you're looking at somebody's analysis of the event. This is not always labeled. So if it's not labeled as such, some of the flags are language that includes a lot of adjectives, language that includes a lot of value judgments, or the word should. Are you seeing the word should? Are you seeing recommendations? Those are the kinds of things that if you are seeing suggestions for action, that is not the role of a piece of reporting. If a piece of reporting is providing a judgment or a suggestion for action, it's kind of moved into the form of commentary or analysis, okay? Another thing to ask yourself is, whose opinion is being offered here? Is this the opinion of a single individual, a group of people? Is it, again, is it a elected official? Is it an individual citizen? Is it someone who was personally affected by a particular event? Do they indicate what their background is and how that influences what they're writing? So this is another question that I'm hoping others on the panel will have some thoughts about, but I do think it's worth being aware of who controls the platforms that we're looking at our news on these days. And that could be anything from social media to traditional news sources, but I think it's worth asking. There's obviously been a lot of discussion this week about Twitter and Facebook and other sources choosing to remove Trump from those platforms. And so obviously those folks have removed others from platforms as well. But it does bring up a lot of questions around the distinctions between regulating social media and censoring on social media. It also brings up issues of, I think, media ownership in general and the consolidation of media ownership. So I think just being aware and understanding who owns both our local platforms and our national platforms, and how that influences the diversity of news perspective and news analysis is something that it's worth considering as a reader. This is another point that I wanted to just highlight. I think it's worth remembering that exciting events are really good for the media. And I don't mean to sound cynical, but I do think it's important to recognize that violence and destruction and chaos make for great news. And sometimes that also means that analysis can be driven in a way that is really designed to increase readership, increase viewership, etc. Just because you are seeing an analysis that suggests chaos or crisis doesn't mean you don't get to decide for yourself whether that chaos or crisis is real. So it's just something that I wanted to put out there. And as an example of this, I will mention that I think it was last Wednesday, I heard the CBS news anchor, I think it's Norah O'Donnell, multiple times mention constitutional crisis. We're having a constitutional crisis. And I just paid attention to that. I don't feel like I am a constitutional expert, so I didn't want to weigh in on that, but I thought it was an interesting choice to make that commentary, because it's a piece of analysis to say that there's a constitutional crisis. A similar question was asked, or a question was asked on the local news today of our new Supreme Court justice, or I guess head of the Supreme Court here in Washington, Stephen Gonzalez. So this is someone who obviously knows the Constitution pretty well. And he was asked about his concerns about the events of the past week. And his comments were much more measured. And he said, I'm not concerned about the Constitution. I am concerned about individual events, et cetera. I feel like we still live in a rule of law. And I thought the contrast between those two perspectives were worth noting. And I just point them out because keep in mind, one of those people is on a corporate media platform, and the other one is on a judicial bench, and they have different jobs and they have different roles. So again, keep that in mind. There's value for the media in making content more dramatic than it might necessarily be. And the last thing I have on some of these slides is just questions that I think are worth asking as a reader. In short, I think it's important to recognize that every article that you read has some level of storytelling or narrative frame. You have to decide whether that frame is useful to you and what perspectives or analysis might be missing, or where you might need to look at other sources to get a little bit more range of perspective. So in addition to the questions about the event itself, again, I always think it's worth thinking about the platform that you're using and who is paying for the content, who is publishing the content, and what levels of editorial are going through between the creation of the content and its distribution. How many folks are looking at that content before you're seeing it? And how does that impact the value of that content? So lastly, I just wanted to share a couple of quotes that I think are really helpful in terms of being smarter readers. As soon as something is developed into a narrative, there's storytelling. And so I think it's important to that end to extract the facts and the evidence from the storytelling and decide what the story is for yourself. Robert Caro is a man who's in his 80s now and has spent the last 40 or 50 years doing research on the presidency of Lyndon Johnson and his career. And this is a quote I really like from him that makes the distinction between truth and facts and stories. And we're in a time in our, I think in our history where we want everything really quickly. And unfortunately, getting to the truth is not always a quick process. So I'm going to leave on that note. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to share.
It wouldn't be me if I didn't unmute myself at least once. Thank you so much, Shireen. We appreciate it. I want to point out too that according to Pew Research, Rasmussen, and major polling firms, roughly 60 to 65% of Americans now say their primary and only source for news is social media. The CBS did a poll this morning too that showed that 30% of respondents, and their margin for error was only 3%, are saying that they believe that the events on January 6th were not Trump supporters, but were Antifa people who were dressed up trying to make Trump supporters look bad. So the spin on media is a very big deal. A lot has happened since we joined together last week, and I want to start with our first question to the panel, and that is, we started seeing this morning, streaming live, the second impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump. What do you think the purpose of this is and what will happen? Deepa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Oh gosh, I mean, the purpose of this, I think that there is a performative aspect to it, of course. I think that justice is a performance. There is definitely something, that's being communicated to the public, and the fact that it's taking place in the same building that was occupied a week ago, right? If we think symbolically, there's a certain burning of the sage, right, that's going on, to use a more ritualistic metaphor, right? That this is a ritual that's happening, and there are rules for how this ritual happens, and I do think that occupying the space and starting this process, whether or not it can continue and whether or not it achieves the end that some Democrats may want it to achieve, I think that the performance of it today is significant, and the communication that nobody's above the law, that even our president, even the person supposedly the most powerful person in the free world, whatever that means at this moment, not above the law, I think is significant. So definitely a performative element to what's happening.
Thank you, Deepa. I appreciate it, and I totally agree with you. I also want to point out that the Republican minority leader in the U.S. House, Kevin McCarthy, chose not to rally the Republican Party to support Trump, which is a pretty big statement with a lack of action. 5 Republicans, including Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who's the third in command in terms of party hierarchy, have stated they will vote for impeachment against Mr. Trump. Cristobal, could you put this in historical context for us?
Historical context. So, I mean, first, no president has been impeached twice, right? So a little bit hard to bring context on that one.
Yes.
But I think there is a certain aspect of historical context that we can bring to this. And in all honesty, it's cobbling together things that have happened at different times in history. I think one of the things that we're going to have to reflect on well beyond this period is this sort of division that has led to this moment, and how it's not really unprecedented, and how often our leadership stepped into the same mistakes that were stepped into in the past. There was a recent opinion piece, to be very clear of where it's coming from after Shireen's presentation, from the Washington Post that compared Stephen Douglas in the 1850s, the senator from Illinois who also ran against Lincoln for the Senate seat and won, and was considered to be a moderate kind of Democrat. The Democrats at this time were the party that was pro-slavery. And so the comparison between him and Mitch McConnell is a really interesting one, because one of the things that Douglas tries to do is really navigate a legislative path while using extremist rhetoric and extremist energy to be able to fulfill some very specific legislative goals. And that, in many ways, Douglas was able to do until it didn't work anymore. And unfortunately, when it didn't work anymore, it led into the Civil War, right? So there are certain aspects where you can kind of think back and be like, wow, these are some parallels that you can learn a lot from history. As far as the impeachment itself, I was kind of reflecting on that this morning, and it really almost seems like, one aspect that we have to negotiate as a society and our government has to really negotiate is, if none of the events that have happened up to now are impeachable events, then what is impeachable? What is impeachment there for? What sort of balance is there against the presidency on any measures, right? Impeachments in the past have been along lines of, in the Johnson case, not going through with what the radical Republicans post the Civil War wanted to happen legislatively. So they impeached them on those grounds, not enacting certain laws. For Clinton, it was about lying about a sexual affair, impeached on those grounds. And then, the other two impeachments that we have is the current one and the one for Trump that dealt with really trying to get help for an election from foreign sources, right? If it seems like the sort of impeachable possibilities have become more and more extreme, and yet if you do not impeach and you do not remove, then what is that there for? Right? I mean, I would just have to ask. I keep thinking of Professor Turley's statements, a constitutional expert who is stating now that, this is kind of a rush impeachment and that it shouldn't be carried on. And I mean, I just wonder, what would that mechanism be there for, if not for these sort of measures? So I think that historically, we have to think about what aligns in the past with what we're seeing now. There's no clear parallel. But there are certain ways that you can think about lessons from the past. And then also, what standard are you setting for the future? What behavior are you condoning? What things are you going to accept? That's something that unfortunately in the last 4 years, we have been forced to really have to face, that a lot of what we thought was behavior we expected was really norms we hoped people did, right? That's basically what it amounted to. And so I think now we have to really think about what that looks like in our government. And those aren't easy things. I think, when we frame it in that way, a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing about First Amendment, about freedom of speech, about what you can say, cannot say, we'll have to negotiate as a nation and as a government.
Very good. Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it. I'm going to throw this over to Jim, who has set up our next question from the audience.
Yeah, and I'm going to take these out of order to keep it a little bit on the topic that you just had. And part of this has been answered in the chat, but it'd be great to hear more response on it. Do you think if President Trump had conceded, the riots would not have happened? Would other political events have happened? And what might have happened had he just conceded right in November?
Jonathan, would you like to speak to that first? You're on mute.
Yeah, can you repeat the question quickly?
Yes, it is. Would we still have seen the political riots last week if Trump had conceded the election back in the fall? Or would we have seen different political events? And what type of events might we have seen if he had conceded?
I don't know. That's a difficult question. I think what we really need to think about now is how do we stop this craziness that's going on, and that we look from historical perspective on what's going on right now and how it is sullying the reputation of the United States as a world leader in human rights and democracy. What happens here affects everywhere in the world. And so So it's hard to know exactly what would have happened. But it's sad to see, the U.S. kind of losing its leadership on the world stage, and seeing the checks and balances that Chris Ball, referred to as being under real threat.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd also encourage anyone to look at the news sources from around the world. Al Jazeera English is really good. The BBC is really good as well. I try to keep an eye on it to see different perspectives, and I find that a value. Larry, what do you say on this?
I think the thing we have to keep in mind is it's over 2 months since this election happened. And without that orderly transfer of power that we're so used to, right? The thing that is so defining of America's form of democracy is this transfer of power that really speaks to the kind of political legitimacy of those moments, which can be moments that are fraught with the potential for chaos. That for over 2 months, right? It wasn't that there was a kind of wavering on it. There's a very kind of adamant, regular response, went through courts, went through processes, went through the various talking points. And all of that allows this kind of, kettle to boil and to build. I think we'd have a very different situation. I think you'd see plenty of protests. I think you'd see plenty of events regionally around the country. I think you'd see centralized events in DC, but I don't think you would see it it's all been building to that point, because every single time there's a court challenge, it was like, this is the moment when things are going to change. And every time this is the moment this is going to change. And this was seen as the kind of last moment, and thus creating that kind of tension and crisis necessary to go to this next space. But I also wanted to speak really fast about what we're talking about with impeachment, because what I think people aren't examining is what this impeachment means for the Republican Party. When we talk about things like realignment and the parties being due for realignment for a really long time, you are seeing realignment in real time. When the caucus doesn't push for full support of the president, they're essentially creating a litmus test in real time for people to cast a vote one direction or the other. We are seeing right now the leader of the Senate, the outgoing leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, still not saying, he openly today just said that he hasn't decided yet how he's going to vote on this, which is totally different than what we've seen before, essentially opening up the Republican caucus in the Senate as well to have this check mark for history as to whether or not they decide to engage in that support. And so we have to remember that this impeachment process is also something the Republican Party is utilizing to figure out what this direction is. And they don't have a lot of time to suss this out. So you're going to see individual members putting themselves out there.
Yes, preach, Larry. I totally agree with that. And we're seeing the division so much in real time. Senator Murkowski said she doesn't know if she can stay in the Republican Party if they align behind Trump. And McConnell saying something today was huge. And he was putting out, or he plans to put out more statements later in the day. Thank you both. Jim, do you have our next question?
Yes, I have a question that one of our guests would like to read out. So Eric, I am going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
All right, thank you, sir. My question is, real quick, sorry. Here we go. Why are we worried about this now? Should the new president be talking about bringing us together and fix our country's problems? I feel like it's hope over anger. I think for a lot of people, it's kind of confusing, and I'm just curious what you guys have to say about it.
Deepa, would you like to start? And then we'll throw it to Zach.
Yeah, I think, so Biden has definitely been pushing the narrative of unity. He ran his campaign around unity, right? That he's the person who can bring the country together, who can heal the country. It's interesting to see that he also is willing to sort of step aside and allow this impeachment process to happen even after his inauguration, right? His office, I think yesterday talked about that, they would divide the senators' workday so that half of their days after the inauguration would be devoted to the impeachment and half of them to actually working on confirming his new cabinet. So even Biden, right, the pro-unity president recognizes that there is some need for holding this administration and particularly this president accountable, that there is something so profound about the divisions that this president has exacerbated, because these divisions exist, right? These divisions are foundational to American life and American politics. They're not going to go away. And, you know, these processes like impeachment, these processes are important. They're necessary to do some of the work of healing. So I don't know that they are necessarily opposed to one another. And I would encourage us to resist narratives that say that, you know, that impeachment is divisive. No, I would say that inciting a riot is divisive, right? I would say that building a candidacy around a border wall and otherizing people of color and immigrants is divisive, right? That this is actually part of how we heal and possibly move forward together, if that's even possible.
Thank you, Deepa. Totally agree. I would also say that there's been a lot of debate on Twitter about whether we should be talking about healing or whether or not we should be taking the opportunity to create reform in our system, because there are clearly differences. How Black Lives Matter were treated when they wanted to protest versus this riot that ensued is very, very telling and will be investigated. Some of the first charges are now being, people are being indicted today. Zach, what do you have to say?
Well, ultimately, when it comes to questions of healing and reform, motivations, desires on behalf of the electorate, folks that vote, folks that don't vote, I just have to ask, what is the actual, what anxieties are different groups pointing to as the ones that need to be addressed first and foremost, right? I mean, ultimately, the folks that last Wednesday that marched on that went to, you know, rioted at the Capitol, I suspect they would have a much different answer as to what needs to be fixed. And again, this may be kind of obvious, but their response is going to be a lot different than the responses that might be said in this room, for example. And one thing that Biden's going to have a really difficult time doing is convincing the Republicans, not the ones that are willing to work with the Democrats, but ones that kind of haven't been as willing to work with Democrats for whatever reason, whether it's electoral reasons, whether it's fundraising reasons, and try to sort of get them to, I don't know, do some old school politicking, some old school compromise, whereby we can make some of these piecemeal changes that might sort of alleviate some of the anxieties that I think a lot of people across the country who may not feel as active, may not feel as included in the process, to try to get them feeling a little more comfortable with government again. That's going to be, look, there's opportunities here, but again, after last Wednesday, it doesn't seem like the trust in government is probably just as low as it's been in a long time. And so I think ultimately there's going to be this question of, can you kind of let your party guard down a little bit? And that goes for the Democrats too, frankly. I mean, kind of giving some air to folks that maybe they didn't want to give air to. I'm not sure if I have a great answer for this, but again, reform kind of is based on interest and willingness, and I don't know. Maybe this is that opportunity moment, though. Maybe this is the opportunity structure that can breed some compromise. I'll stop there. I don't.
Thank you, Zach. I would like to say that as we speak, we all have our own internal biases, and our statements as your panelists reflect our views and don't necessarily reflect the views of North Seattle College or the Seattle colleges in general. I was supposed to say that earlier, so we have that out of the way. I'd like to throw this to Jim again for the next question, please.
All right, great. We have a question about the transition process that Jeff is going to ask. So I'm not unmute him now.
Hi, so there was a previous reduction in the transition time, I understand, between the elected president, the incumbent coming in, and the outgoing president. So can we expect to see legislation to shorten that further in view of how this transition hasn't gone well?
Larry, would you like to take that up?
So you're talking about the gap between Election Day and inauguration, correct?
Yes.
Sorry, Larry.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, since those things are prescribed by the Constitution, it's kind of tough to adjust the metrics around that. when we start to fiddle with that language in particular, especially when it's so clearly outlined, then we're talking like constitutional amendment territory. And we're notoriously bad at doing that in, any type of rapid way. Country's been around for a bit. Well, we got 26 of these things. So probably not. What I think will change will be how we think about the kind of markers of the transition of power itself. And when those things happen, I think that those will become kind of more rigid in how we think about it if there is kind of willingness with whoever the next departing kind of leader is and who's coming in afterwards around those things. It's a good question because it creates so much space for the kind of tension building that I discussed before. But it's a tough road to travel to change dates that are so clearly prescribed.
If I may add, yes, it's true the Constitution has specific dates and prescriptions, but we should expect some reform, some electoral reform. There are a lot of things that Congress can do at the federal level. For instance, this whole rule about the GSA has to do an official finding saying that the transition can start and money can be released. States can do a lot more to tighten up their own systems as well to bring some stability and certainty to the process.
Jonathan, could you share what the GSA is for our participants who may not know?
Yeah, the General Service Administration.
Yes, they provide publication of the hearings and many other services for citizens. Thank you all. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I was gonna jump
Okay.
into Jill just really quickly because I think at the larger level we do have to start thinking about what Congress's response in general as a body, right? Not just Democrats or Republicans, but as a body, what their response will be to an executive that was pretty much allowed to break norms and do whatever they wanted. With very, very little reining in of their abilities, right? One thing that we have seen throughout the 20th century into the 21st century was a ceding by Congress of power to the executive. And, even in the point that Jeff asked about the transition, right? Like the Obama administration had put in a structure to facilitate transitions, but that was done through the executive branch. I would expect to see more being dictated through the legislative branch that then makes it law. And by making it law, then an executive can't just decide to do it or not, or if they decide not to, they can be held up to that standard of law, right? So I think we may be seeing, and this is trying to read a little bit in the tea leaves, and a historian, I try not to do that, as people know in the past. We're better with the past, but I would expect that we might start seeing a shift in looking at the Congress itself trying to rein in powers from the executive branch to some extent, because it's just, we have seen the result of that in somebody who doesn't really, I think it's harsh to say, but I think it's very true. Doesn't really care about much of these structures, cares more about their brand and their own individual achievement or success than the structures of government. And, that can happen again. Why wouldn't it happen again? If we're a society that can vote through a cult of personality, we could end up with somebody who has the same sort of inclination. So what will Congress do to limit that?
And we need a president who's willing to go along, a president who realizes that it's better for the system to actually cede some of their own power while they're in power, and have some common agreement about that. Because it's, after you actually get in power, your presidents don't want to cede that power, but maybe we can have a case where, a president is wise enough to say, well, maybe it has gotten out of hand.
And I just wanted to say one quick thing about this. So there is a really amazing image that's out there of the Capitol rioters, like with the Trump flag in front of a 19th century painting that hangs in Congress. General George Washington resigning his commission. That's the title of the painting. And it's a portrait, or it's a painting of Washington, you know, basically handing back his presidency to Congress, right? He served only one term and he conceded, he gave up his power. And what it shows is the power ultimately of the legislative branch, right? And we have watched that power, as you know, my colleagues have been talking about, diminished over the last, you know, 2+ centuries. And that's our power. That's the power of the people. That's our power. We should be pissed off about that, right?
Yes. Thank you, Deepa. Jim, I'm going to throw it to you. I think we have time for one more question.
Great. And this is actually a pair of related questions that Jess and Kara posted at different points in the chat. When do we get to have the conversation about the Constitution being deeply flawed? Maybe government invented by a small group of white men hundreds of years ago isn't actually something we should be basing our lives on today. Should we, the people, work towards a new Constitution to include all human rights, not modeled after white men colonials?
Deepa, I'm going to throw that to you since social justice and intersectionality is your specialty.
Yeah, I mean, we have in this country a really old constitution. It's the oldest living constitution that exists on the planet. You know, we are following rules that were written centuries ago under very different circumstances, and change as a result has been really hard to come by. This is a constitution that is framed around a certain set of political rights that uphold the privileges and interests of a particular segment of society, namely landowners, namely property owners, productive property owners, profit seekers. And there, in the period after the American Revolution, you know, we've seen a lot of social movements and uprisings around the world that have stressed a different set of rights, socioeconomic rights. And our Constitution has a very, very, very difficult time bringing those rights in: the right to education, the right to healthcare, right? The right to love whoever you want and live with whomever you want, right? All of these rights are not enshrined in the Constitution: the right to childcare, to maternal leave. So I definitely think that we are long overdue for new rights to be enshrined and protected by our government. How that's done, whether it's through a constitutional convention or through a sort of shredding and reformulating, you know, I think that's yet to be seen.
Thank you, Deepa. I would also say that one of the topics that keeps coming up in class and through emails is that there's a question as to whether the social platforms barring Mr. Trump is an infraction on the civil liberties we're talking about. I would like to add that into our discussion right before we leave too, and note that in 1969, the Supreme Court held in Brandenburg versus Ohio that the government may forbid incitement speech directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action or likely to incite or produce such action, such as a speech to a mob or what we saw on the 6th. And there's a newer field of study called stochastic terrorism in political science that talks about using language to incite outcomes that are violent too. Zach, do you have any comments on the civil liberties and civil rights being infringed on through this process? Are we watching cancel culture or response to keep people safe?
This is a big question, and I mean, kind of a one that I think everybody in this room is going to be grappling with, and our students too, for quite some time. You know, when Twitter and Facebook decided to silence the president last week, I'll state my bias. I was quite pleased with that. I was like, finally, 4 years, and we've turned off the fire hose. But then, you know, Angela Merkel, she went on the record and said, I don't know, you know, she's the chancellor of Germany. And I personally look to Germany's constitutional system as sort of a modernized version, something we could aspire to. And I was kind of like, well, interesting. You know, if someone who seems rational and level-headed for a world leader is saying, I don't know how what America is doing is if they're walking kind of on a fine line or going down a slippery slope. The reality is, though, that look, the Brandenburg case, speech that does incite violence is not protected, right? It's the same. That it's getting lumped into cancel culture, I think would make a lot of constitutional lawyers kind of roll their eyes a little bit. The question is, right, what if the speech has some type of purpose, facilitates some part of the discourse? And I think that's what we're seeing with what the president's speech over the last 4 years, in particular the last 2 weeks, has been, is this contributing to anything other than just getting people riled up, right? And that's where, if that's the case, it's a bit, I would say, probably easier to pinpoint what is more overtly political versus what is more sort of implicitly political. I don't really have a nice, neat answer for this, but the fact that, once again, America is we're having this debate amongst sort of elite corporations are sort of setting the tone on it rather than sort of the American people. I'll just say that that's sort of, I find very fascinating and very telling, I think, of the moment we're in, where you know, we keep talking about we want more for the people, more democracy, and yet we're letting sort of, you know, groups of organized elite interests, I use elite in a neutral sense, sort of setting the tone on and tenor of this conversation. So we'll see how this plays out. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much.
I was just going to add one quick thing, Jill, if I can. I think we also need to make a distinction in a few things. First, the standard set by the Brandenburg case is something for definitely a legal structure. We have to remember impeachment is not that. Impeachment is a political structure, right? They look to laws, and there's a whole bunch of lawyers in that room that are continually looking to laws. But impeachment in its most basic sense is a political process that holds itself to a standard set in the Constitution, and that has quite a bit of leeway with the words of high crimes and misdemeanors, right? So, you know, whether you can finally define it as, you know, inciting violence or not by the legal standard may not actually matter in this case if the Senate decides, yes, he should be removed. It won't make a single difference, right? It may matter later on if he's going to have any sort of legal ramifications. That may be a standard. The other thing I would say is that in the whole cancel culture discussion, which I will show my bias here, it's a term I despise because it is often used to then justify not having consequences for your speech. There is nothing that protects you from consequences for what you say, right? If you say something, you can't just relinquish all responsibility for what that does in the world and relinquish all consequences from what that does. You may have the right to say it, but then you have to deal with what happens afterwards. If I'm in a classroom and I make statements, at some point, I have to deal with those consequences. I may have a certain amount of protections, but I may have to deal with those consequences. And I understand that. I'm responsible for what I say. This sort of parameter that we set, that anytime somebody is found by a private company or a for-profit company to have somehow barred their standard of morality, and hence they can no longer be on that platform, somehow limits their freedom of speech, is absurd, right? The president has a podium he can walk to at any minute and every reporter will cover it. He has never had his speech infringed. He has never had his ability to put out what he wants to say stopped, right? Just because Twitter cancels him, that doesn't matter. None of that matters. He can do that at any time, at any moment. Even if you're in no platform whatsoever and you've been banned from anywhere, you can still walk to a national park and step inside the freedom of speech zone and say whatever you want. Your freedom of speech is protected, right? In that situation. So we need to stop equating having access through private means or social media as if that is speech that's protected under the First Amendment. It isn't. Is speech protected under Mark Zuckerberg? Is speech protected under these all the standards that you say agree to so that you can use your new phone or whatever, and then you decide to ignore? So that's something that we have to really come into sort of the 21st century in our legislation and really understand that we can't continue to basically allow whatever a corporation decides is profitable for them, to dictate what we will consume as speech or not speech.
Thank you, and wholeheartedly agree. I'd like to thank all of the members of our panel today. I'd like you to mark your calendars too. On February 4th, Nikita Oliver will be joining us to talk to us about effective state and local civic engagement, providing some examples from their experience. Also, I want to share with you that the House is now voting on the impeachment as we speak. Thank you to everyone who is here today. We look forward to seeing you on February 4th and are here if you have any questions. Take care and have a good day. Be safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.